Hello everyone, how are you going? And welcome to Why Didn't Canada Join the American Revolution? Something that I would have thought that they would have no choice in the matter of, and so why didn't they?
When the American War for Independence broke out, 13 of Britain's North American colonies opted to sever ties with the mother country. However, some of those colonies chose to remain loyal and afterwards would go on to form the Dominion of Canada. Thus the question is, why didn't Canada join the American Revolution? Before continuing, it's important to stress that in 1775, Canada didn't exist. It was instead comprised of the colonies of Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, Quebec, Rupert's Land and St. John's Island. Barring Quebec, the differences between the peoples of these states and those of the 13 colonies were no more or less stark. Before it can be determined why all of the colonies didn't leave, it's necessary to know why the 13 that did leave chose to break away in the first place. Much of the anger directed at Britain was due to the idea that the recent acts of King George III and his parliament violated the rights of Englishmen. This is why the province of Quebec had no interest in revolting, since, it wasn't English.
Alright, well there is going to be a lot to take in this short animated documentary. He's just going to absolutely fly through them, but yes, that is definitely true. At least I knew that just going off the start, that Canada wasn't exactly Canada just yet. But it was interesting to hear him talking about the colonies in the first place, because I've never even heard of a half of them between Rupert's Land. I mean, it's all of the Hudson Bay area, which I believe was delegated in terms of from the king or from the monarch at the time, just going, okay, this place, you can touch everywhere that flows into that area. And they went, hang on a second, we don't actually know how big that really is. And all of a sudden they own half of North America. But I guess out of all of them, they're the most unchanged in terms of where the modern day Canadian border is. Or actually, I guess Newfoundland is also virtually unchanged as well. And so yeah, between the two of them, the two reds on this map, they certainly set a precedence compared to the others.
Speaking of Quebec, it was itself one of the reasons for the revolution. The Quebec Act had expanded the size of the French-speaking colony and granted freedom of religion there, which to the Protestant English-speaking colony surrounding them was terrible. For Quebec, its options were to stay with Britain, whom they didn't exactly like but had granted them rights and more territory, or to the rebels who despised them. But what about when the French began to help the Americans? Didn't Quebec want to go back to being under French rule? Well, no. Being a British colony gave Quebec access to a much larger international trading market, and also, to put it bluntly, the French didn't really care about it anymore. Another reason for the American Rebellion is what are known as the Intolerable Acts. Things like the Stamp Act, the Sugar Act and the Quartering Act took away rights and privileges that American colonists had previously held, which shockingly upset them.
Funnily enough, that does seem to be true. When you're just having something and you get comfortable within it and you go, okay, I can live this lifestyle, that works for me, and then you go, why is it being taken away from me? You generally aren't too happy about that. I mean, it is always interesting for me to hear just how much of this part of the world at the time was just not wanted by anyone. You think about how much North America plays a role in virtually everyone's daily lives, but then to just go back in time and see how the Spanish completely abandoned it, the French didn't really care anymore and went, yeah, I guess go with Britain if you really want to stay there. And then the British, of course, are also doing things that make it so that no one really likes them. And so overall, they're not looking too hot in North America part of the world. Even the fact that something like this is even possible, I don't know what the timeline is exactly about what that expansion is, but that is a huge difference just to go a little bit along the river to all of a sudden having all of the Great Lakes and everything just up along that river all the way up into Newfoundland. Like, it's pretty incredible just how much land they just went, yes, thank you very much. And obviously then, like he said, everything else comes along with it, being the laws and the religions or not, or whatever you want to believe in, just come along with that expansion, that great expansion. It's huge. So I can understand what he means by all of a sudden they weren't happy that freedom of religion was allowed in such a great area compared to just a tiny little one.
Another reason for the American Rebellion is what are known as the Intolerable Acts. Things like the Stamp Act, the Sugar Act and the Quartering Act took away rights and privileges that American colonists had previously held, which shockingly upset them. The taxes that Britain imposed were done so without the consent of the Americans, leading to cries of no taxation without representation, to which Britain's response was, the people living in Britain itself barely have representation, so what makes you so special?
Wow. I mean, I guess to be fair, it is very of the times, isn't it? But my goodness, what makes you so special, you people across the pond? I mean, you're not even part of our country. Why should we care about you even as much as the people in our country? I mean, it is very fair to be saying no taxation without representation, but geez, they really were fighting the uphill battle just with that one, just especially when you look at the amount of land that they had. My goodness, no wonder Quebec just wanted to stay a British Empire, part of the British colony, because, well, look at that, you got all of North America, all of known North America at the time. And look, I will be the first to admit that every time I watch one of these videos, so much just goes over my head because I just don't know enough about all this history. There was just so much that I was never taught in the first place, because why would I be? I wasn't growing up there. And so I then have to try and play catch up the entire time. But my goodness, to me at least, this entire video seems very, very quick and very dense with information. So it's very well done in that regard. But my goodness, what are half these things? That is what I'm wondering, because why do they hate them so much? I mean, I can guess why they hate it with the taxation. I can understand if they're going to be taking something to do with the sugar, but then quartering. I don't know if that sounds too good. Oh, quartering in terms of a housing quartering, not hung, drawn and quartered quartering. Okay then, that makes a little bit more sense. I don't see how that fully would have affected. Actually, if I probably just keep reading, if the barracks were too small to house all the soldiers, then locals were to accommodate the soldiers in local inns, blah blah blah. Right, that is where it would have started to just affect them more often. All of a sudden you just have all these soldiers just living in your house because that's just what the law stipulates, and you go, wow, I was actually quite preferring my life of loneliness before.
Also, mass financial problems across the colonies combined with the ban on expanding westward in order to prevent war with the Indians meant that revolution wasn't too far away. Some of these acts, combined with economic issues, negatively affected the peoples of the later Canadian colonies just as badly. Unlike the 13 colonies though, the reaction wasn't quite as fierce there. In places like Rupert's Land and St. John's Island, the acts weren't quite as important since their economies relied on natural resource extraction. Whereas in Newfoundland and Nova Scotia, the acts were just as disruptive. These colonies did see some resistance to British policies. Nova Scotia had close ties to New England and much of its population were immigrants from there. Thus, they too were angry at the new taxes, and this anger culminated in a couple of riots, but ultimately no more than that.
Oh, that's so Canadian of them, just a couple of riots, no more than that. I mean, I'm glad I finally got to hear a little bit more about Rupert's Land, but to hear the first words out of that is just can't stamp a fish. I mean, they don't lie up there, I guess is what you can say. I can only imagine that so many fish would have been up there. Oh, it would have been glorious, and it just would have been overfished immediately, let alone the entire fur trade that would have gone through there and just ripped everything out of the ground it possibly could. But geez, just the fact that they were going, oh yeah, I guess, you know, we can impose these laws and we can deal with them because we're not really tied to you. You are actually quite a while away, you know, this is the 1700s. Things aren't getting that far that fast.
These colonies did see some resistance to British policies. Nova Scotia had close ties to New England and much of its population were immigrants from there. Thus, they too were angry at the new taxes, and this anger culminated in a couple of riots, but ultimately no more than that. Much of this was down to the province being much less urbanised, and so what little resistance there was couldn't be organised quickly. Nova Scotia's economy was also reliant on the British military, since Halifax was a garrison town which played host to many Royal Navy vessels.
Right.
Another factor which secured their allegiance was that British troops were needed to fight off Indian raiding. Speaking of which, raiding by American privateers during the war drastically soured the relationship between Nova Scotia and the 13 rebelling colonies and guaranteed further that Nova Scotia would remain loyal to Britain.
Oh, like I said, there was a lot that you have to take in all at once if you're just starting from zero and then you're just going to what this video is providing. But geez, just the fact that then you got these ships going up and down the coast just fighting each other, and also, like, they're already immigrating up there, he said, so you're all basically one and the same. I mean, I don't really know how they would have divided the border and into the two colonies. Especially as I can remember from the other map that we had Purple Quebec just lining their banks on the other side as well, and so yeah, that would have been a very busy time. But I guess that is just what is happening when you're a 17th century colony because, well, besides not even having the choice in the first place, you just don't have the individual backing that you would need to be able to just not have these effects. Like he was saying, for better or worse, there was raiding going on and there was garrisons just parking up shop all day, and so you're not going to be able to feed all these people or whatever you want to call it. All of the resources going into running these things, you need more backing from bigger entities, and that comes straight out of Britain. And so as much as you might love to just be able to just ditch them, and obviously that's exactly what they ended up doing, I can understand why a whole bundle of people would be in two mindsets going, oh, we really don't like what they're doing and how they're controlling our lives, but we're seeing what they're really providing us, and I can't really live without that either.
As for Newfoundland, many of its residents were fishermen who had either relocated from Britain recently or were there for a season to work, and thus inclusion in the British Empire was necessary for their livelihoods. Whilst Newfoundland had many problems similar to those in the American colonies, its distance meant that it lacked a sense of solidarity with those to its south. Thus, they saw themselves not as colonists, but as being entirely British, and most there believed that their problems would not be solved by political separation.
I mean, it is always ridiculous to look at the distance between any of the British colonies, but my goodness, to send someone to Newfoundland Newfoundland just for 6 months at a time just to do some fishing and then come home, you'd spend most of your time on the road, so to say. And so I can understand why you would definitely be feeling more British than even Canadian or colonial, because, well, you're basically on tour. You're not setting up shop for 6 months or even 6 years. No, you're just going over there, doing your thing and heading home as fast as possible just for that tour time.
Thus, they saw themselves not as colonists, but as being entirely British, and most there believed that their problems would not be solved by political separation. There were two other important reasons for Nova Scotia and Newfoundland remaining loyal. The first was that the elites of the colonies hadn't lost any money from Britain's actions, like those in, say, Virginia or Massachusetts. They were mostly naval officers whose income came from their own lands back in Britain and whose position relied on loyalty. Reason number two was a simple one. Proximity. It was quicker to sail to Newfoundland and Nova Scotia than any of the American colonies, meaning that any retaliation that did happen would have hit them first, and that was not a tantalising proposition for them.
Yeah, definitely. You'd be going, I don't exactly want to be just a shield for the rest of the country very much. I mean, I know there's the Canadian shield, but that's not going to be me. I'm just going to be going back home, earning an income, or at least just staying here and being happy with what I'm getting out of Great Britain instead of just fighting them. And I mean, it certainly all adds to what I was talking about before in terms of there is so much going on everywhere. Everyone even just individually looking for self-preservation, and I can't blame them. That's just what everyone does all the time. But then at the same time, you also have all these other people's opinions that you really have to consider, because otherwise you're going to be having an internal revolution as well as an external revolution perhaps. And so even though I do really have to try and trudge through this entire video just going, oh, what's that? That's right, just claw at the back of my mind for any little piece of information that I already have and just let everything else just duck and cover. It really was a very well made video that covered so many different aspects, and just I guess it all comes down to the fact that they just had too much skin in the game just to be leaving Britain. Like they said, even Quebec was able to expand to a massive degree as we see, but even they were just going, no, we just want to stay part of the British Empire for that trade route. And once you see this map and you see the true scale of the entire British Empire at the time, you don't blame them one bit, because you can either go, okay, we can stay part of all of this, you know, we've generally got what we want, we've got all a free religion, we've got all these things, yes, we have to pay a few taxes, but is it worth doing that just to stay away from the blue that hates us? I reckon it would be so. And so even though I could look at a modern map and just realize who ended up with who, at the same time it would never tell you why they did what they did, and honestly this was a great video that just explains so much of that. But anyway, in saying that, I reckon I'm going to call it there. So thank you for watching this video. If you did enjoy it, feel free to do the YouTube algorithmic things down below. Also, if this is the first video of mine that you are watching, then make sure to go check out any other ones I've done. Also make sure to go check out the original video down in the description below, or hey, maybe even just want to consider subscribing so that you don't miss another one of these in the future. But all in all, have a good one and see ya.